Hi, good morning or good afternoon, whenever it is that you're watching this. If you're watching it, it's probably Christmas Day, maybe Christmas morning, Christmas afternoon. Maybe you couldn't wait to see what is on this DVD, and you started it early, or maybe you're watching it online through the link. Maybe you're even watching it after Christmas, and this has been shared with you from a friend or family member. Whatever the case is, just want to welcome you here to People's EC Church. I'm Pastor Mike, and wanted to take some time to share with you some of my favorite parts about Christmas and my favorite scriptures, and seeing the connection of Jesus from the very beginning of the Bible through the end, and just how he is interweaved through all of this. And if you've been attending People's for a while, if you've been through some Advent seasons with us, this is probably a lot of things that I've talked about in the past. It's my favorite, so it normally comes up at some part during the Christmas season. If you are new to People's through this past year, then this is probably going to be a lot of brand new stuff, and I'm just super excited to share it with you. So as I walk through this, I call this a single thread, because we are walking through and seeing how just interconnected and perfectly lined up everything is, from the prophecies before Jesus' birth to his birth, the foreshadowings to the events that come to fruition in Jesus' life and death. Maybe you've walked through the Christmas seasons past, and you've had some things that you've wondered about, some questions, some pieces that just weren't answered. Why is it that salvation needs to come through Jesus' death? Right? Jesus comes into this world. We know the story of his birth. That's what we're celebrating. Why is it that he had to come to die? Why does that have to be the way? Why does Jesus need to be born of a virgin mother? Well, what's that all about? Why couldn't that happen differently? Why did Jesus need to be born in Bethlehem of all cities? Why couldn't it be his hometown? Why wasn't it Jerusalem? Why was it Bethlehem? Why did the angels come to the shepherds? How did they find the right manger? Right, of all the people that the angels could have come to, why was it the shepherds that night? And Bethlehem wasn't a huge city, but it certainly wasn't a village of just 10 or 15 or 20 houses. How in the world did they find the right manger that night? It could have taken days, and yet it seems that they knew exactly right where to look. Why did Jesus need to come into Jerusalem a week early on Palm Sunday, just to leave again? At the end of his life, we see this triumphant entry, and it's a week early, and then he leaves, and then it's a week till he comes back. Why is that? How does that fit into everything? And eventually we see that the reason, the purpose of Jesus' life, the reason that we're celebrating his birth is because of his death on the cross, but he gave up his spirit in those final moments. Why did he do that? I want to walk with you through how all of this is connected. We see from the very beginning, Genesis 3, the fall happens, sin enters the world, and immediately God gives us this foreshadowing of how Jesus will conquer the serpent one day, that his foot shall be upon his head. And then 15, Genesis 15, we start to get a little bit clearer of a picture of how this is going to come about. We've talked in the past about this. Genesis 15 is one of the most instrumental chapters, most important chapters in the entire Bible, because we see a covenant that is made between God and Abram. And God promises that this land will be Abram's, that he will have the promised land, that he will have all of these descendants that fill the earth. And Abram says, God, how will I know this will be? And God enters into a covenant with Abram at that point. And we see it laid out there. Maybe we don't recognize it as that if we're not familiar with ancient Near East covenants, but it's there. The animal is cut in half. And there is a whole ceremony, a whole procedure that goes along with it. It mirrors our modern day weddings in many, many ways. There's a close tie, and that covenant was meant to be for life. The only way out of a covenant, of a blood covenant that they entered into, was through death. You either lived long enough that you died of old age, or you broke the covenant and the other party was allowed to put you to death. The penalty was death for breaking the covenant. But something really peculiar happens in Genesis 15. Abram doesn't actually walk through the whole ceremony with God. What we see in that passage is that Abram is put into a deep sleep, and instead, it's a smoking oven and a flaming torch that passes through the animals that had been cut in half. God passes through twice, once on behalf of himself, once on behalf of Abram. And if you're an Israelite, if you know, as they would have, the story of the Exodus, of the Israelites in the desert, that image of smoke and fire, that is God through and through, as the Israelites followed the smoke by day, the fire by night for those 40 years in the wilderness. What God was doing in this, though, is something that is really spectacular and amazing. He was saying, Abram, I'm not going to ask you to walk through this. I'm going to do this on your behalf, so that if either one of us breaks this covenant, I will be the one that pays the price. I will take that penalty on behalf of you. So in doing so, we know that Abram, his descendants, they do not perfectly follow the covenant, right? We're sinful, we're disobedient. So if God is going to keep his promise, it means something that's pretty startling. For God to keep his promise, he must die. And we say, well, how can that be? God's immortal. He doesn't die. He's from the beginning to the end. He's the Alpha, the Omega. How can this be? And the story, the account of Christmas, the account of his death and Palm Sunday, it all wraps up into this as well. But God doesn't only give us that as a picture of what he will one day do. He gives us what is the greatest foreshadowing of what Christ will do in the Passover, right? Time goes by, generations and generations go by, 400 years. The Israelites are in Egypt in captivity until God raises up Moses, right? Moses and Aaron, they go to speak to the Pharaoh. There's 9 plagues. The 10th plague comes, and what the 10th plague will be is the firstborn of all who are in Egypt will die that night. And God gives the Israelites and anybody who would listen to him the ability to be saved from this judgment that is about to be passed. And what they need to do is they need to take a lamb. It has to be a 1-year-old male, unblemished, perfect lamb. And it needs to be sacrificed. And with hyssop branches, the blood will be wiped on the doorposts of their dwelling places. And that night, as the plague sweeps through the land, as death and judgment comes to all, those who have obeyed God will be saved by the blood of the Lamb. And in this, we see, as time goes by, that this is a perfect representation, a perfect foreshadowing of what Jesus will do for us. He's our Passover lamb. It's his blood in which we are saved. The New Testament says it this way. John says in his gospel, quoting John the Baptist, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," as John the Baptist saw Jesus coming over the hill. Paul writes to the Corinthians, "For Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed." Right, so the New Testament authors, man, when they looked back and they saw who Jesus was and saw this connection, they put it into writing. Time goes by, generations go by, and more prophecies come about. Right? In Isaiah, it says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel." So we have this prophecy that is given that there is going to be a virgin who gives birth and bear a son, and his name will be Emmanuel, God with us. So it's this prophecy of God coming into this world to dwell with us, and it's going to be in an amazing supernatural way. It'll be through a virgin birth. We see, of course, in the Nativity, in the account of Jesus' birth, this is exactly how it happened. The angel Gabriel comes to Mary, lets her know that she will be this one. She will be the virgin who will give birth to the Christ child, and it has to be this way. And it goes the whole way back to Genesis 15. The only way God could fulfill his promise of dying for our sins, taking the penalty that we rightfully should have paid, was to come as fully human and fully God. And that could only be done through the virgin birth. If he came as the child of two earthly parents, it would have just been another person. It would have been another human. It wouldn't have been God. It was through this supernatural birth that we see Jesus coming, fully human, fully God, able to die on the cross for our sins, but overcome and conquer death. So that's how the Christ child is conceived, but as time goes on, months go by, we see that there's a census that is taking place, and Joseph and his family need to report back to his hometown, which was Bethlehem. And God makes this line up perfectly that they come back to this city of Bethlehem, and it's at the time that Mary's about to give birth, and they come into the city. There is no place for them, right? There's no place at the inn. So what are they going to do? Well, they have to figure something out. That night, the shepherds receive a message from the angels. A multitude of them come, and it says, "Do not be afraid, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. For there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be the sign to you. You will find a babe wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger." Think about this. We picture this, right? That there are shepherds, and they're out in the field. They're just watching their sheep, doing their job, trying to make sure nothing happens to them. All of a sudden, the angels are appearing. They're saying that the Christ, the Lord, is going to be born this day in your city. And the sign will be, you will find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger. How in the world did they find him? Hey, this will be the sign. There's going to be a baby wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger. How did they know where to go? Where do they start off looking? I think the shepherds knew exactly where to look. And I think there was a really good chance that they probably even spoke to Mary and Joseph that evening before the angels appeared to them. See, there's this prophecy in the Old Testament. It's in Micah chapter 4, verse 8. It says, "For as for you, tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you will come, yes, the former dominion will come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. As for you, tower of the flock," Midgal Eder in the Hebrew. What is this saying? Why Bethlehem? It all comes together. You see, there's something special about the city of Bethlehem. On the outskirts of the city, there were special shepherds that lived there and a special flock. This flock was the flock of the Passover lambs that were birthed and raised until it was time for them to be sacrificed. The shepherds that were out in the field, watching over them, were a very special group of shepherds. They were connected to the temple, and yet they were in charge of raising these very special sheep. You can see up on the screen here, this is a picture of what would have been an example of the tower of the flock. Right, the shepherds, they want to be able to look out over their sheep. So they want some elevation to see. So they would build these small towers, these platforms that they could go up into the top and be able to look out over their flock. The one on the screen here is a picture of one. This is a photo from the 1930s of one in Beth El, Samaria. And would have been very similar to those that existed during the time of Jesus' birth. Here's more of a close-up of what it looks like. And these were found all over the area. Here's another picture of one. And what you will notice in these pictures, there is a platform up at the top for the shepherds to look out over, but in the bottom there's a door that's there. And that door was to enter into a room at the bottom of the tower, and that is where the pregnant sheep would be brought in to give birth, to get them out of the elements. So that they would be safe, protected from the weather, that they could give birth to the lambs, and that the lambs could be taken care of immediately. It would have made perfect sense for Mary and Joseph as they went around to the city, went to their relatives, and there was no room for them to stay there. They go, what do we do now? as they're looking, they most likely would have came to the shepherds. Shepherds would have allowed the pregnant Mary to go in, at least be out of the elements for that night. And it's here that Mary gives birth. Jesus was born among the flock of the Passover lambs. But it's even more amazing than just that. You see, when the shepherds would give birth to the lambs, they would do a number of things right away. Remember, going back to the Passover story, they had to be male, one-year-old lambs, but they had to be unblemished, right? They had to be perfect, without any flaw, just as Jesus is, right? We know that now. But these lambs, they had to be perfect just that same way. So when they were born, they would be scooped up. They would be placed in a manger. You don't want the lamb to be laying on the floor where the sheep, the adult sheep, could step on it and leave blemishes, imperfections with the lamb. So it would be scooped up. It would be laid inside the manger, and it would be swaddled in cloths, right? Because you don't want the lamb to be flailing about. It's newly birthed, and you don't want it to injure itself and moving all around inside of the manger. So it would be wrapped up in cloth. And, well, this wasn't just any normal cloth. These are the special Passover lambs that are being born. So the cloth that was given to these very special shepherds was that of the retired old cloths of the robes of the priests that served in the temple. So as the shepherds hear this sign from the angels, that the sign would be that they are to go and find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths lying in a manger, I think they went right back to their tower, right back to where they knew that couple was pregnant, about to have a baby. And as they walked in, they would have seen Jesus, baby Jesus, wrapped in priestly garments, lying in the manger, just as they had seen over and over again the Passover lambs as they were born. What's amazing, though, is it's not just this birth, but Jesus' whole life is unified. There's this common thread that goes throughout it. It all links perfectly together. Jesus' birth and death are the most unifying events this world has ever seen, will ever know. And it ties back into that last week of Jesus' earthly life. It says that he was in Bethany. He was visiting Lazarus, having dinner with him and his family. This is after Lazarus had been raised from the grave. And the crowds were gathering, and he makes his way into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, right? And if you're traveling from Bethany into Jerusalem, you're traveling from the east, you're traveling westward, and as you're coming in, you are going to be coming in from this direction. Now, one of the things we have to understand, and the Bible doesn't lay this out perfectly clearly for us, but if you're living at this time, you would have known this, right? The Sunday before Passover, that is the day that the Passover lambs are brought into Jerusalem. They're brought in 1 week early because the Passover lamb would be selected. Each family would select one, and that lamb would live with them for the next week. What happens when you get to live with a lamb for a week and then you sacrifice it in this way, as protection for your family and recognizing what this lamb is doing for you and your family, when you get to know that lamb, that sacrifice means so much more to you than just an animal that you had never known. So this family, they would go and they would meet these lambs as they're being brought into the city. They would select one. Jesus is walking into Jerusalem at the same time as the Passover lambs are brought in. In fact, he's walking alongside of them. Because when you come in from the east, when you come in from Bethany, it's a little hard to see here, but if you're coming in from the side, the main road that comes into the city, if you can see it on the screen here, it comes in this way. It's called the Lion's Gate or St. Stephen's Gate, because that's the gate that it said that Stephen was martyred outside of. In the time of Jesus, this was known as the Sheep Gate. Jesus walks in through the very same gate that the Passover lambs are brought through. This is a photo of the Sheep Gate taken around 1900. And you can see up right next to the top of the door, there's little lions that are kind of carved into the stone where people will call it the Lion's Gate later on. Here's a picture of it today. If you go to Jerusalem, you can still see the same gate that the Passover lambs that Jesus would have walked through coming into the city. You can still see those same lions are there in the wall. Jesus came into Jerusalem on the Sunday before Passover to walk in through the sheep gate with the Passover sheep, with the Passover lambs. And this continuation of God saying, I'm going to save you. I'm going to save you from the judgment. I'm going to save you from death. I'm going to come into this world. I'm going to pay the price like I promised Abram, and I will be your Passover lamb. It will be my blood that saves you. On the cross, Jesus gives up his life. It says here in Luke 23, it was now about the 6th hour, and darkness came over the entire land into the 9th hour. And the Jewish people, the Israelites, they recorded time from sunup. So the 6th hour was roughly about noon, the 9th hour about 3 p.m. And because the sun stopped shining and the veil of the temple was torn in two, and Jesus cried out with a loud voice and said, Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit. And having said this, he died. What's amazing here is tradition holds that it's the 9th hour when the Passover lambs are to be slaughtered throughout Israel, throughout Jerusalem. Jesus gives up his life. He dies at the exact time that the Passover lambs were slain. See, everything in the Bible happens exactly and precisely as it needs to happen. And it just shows us and reinforces for us that God is in complete control of every detail. Everything perfectly lines up. From the decree for the census being perfectly timed so that Mary and Joseph would be back in Bethlehem, that would be Joseph's ancestors' hometown, that there would be no room for them in the places they would have normally stayed. Everything about the nativity, everything about Jesus' birth, everything is exactly as it needs to be. Jesus will tell us in his own words as he walked on this earth. He said, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Jesus comes because God made a promise to Abram and to all the future generations, of which we are a part of that, Jew and Gentile, either through blood or grafted into that tree as spiritual children of his, that God would die and pay the penalty on behalf of us. He showed it to the Israelites through the Passover, and it would be his blood shed on the cross through which we may escape death as well and know everlasting life with him. So this Christmas, I pray that we may know him. We may know his word more fully than ever before. And I pray that this may be a Christmas of sharing this story, of sharing this wonderful news of why Jesus came into this world, why his birth is so spectacular, why it's worth celebrating every single year. And I pray that you have an amazing day, an amazing time celebrating this with your family, and you're able to share this with many, many others as well.